Thank you so much for coming this evening. My name is Liz Metzger, and I'm the library director. And I'm delighted that you're doing your pre-game show here at the library tonight. Our library is 110 years old. It's a Carnegie Library. If it's your first visit here, welcome. If it's not, you're well familiar with our lovely facilities here. I apologize for the fact that we do not have shades on every window. They are obviously 110 years old as well, and half of them are missing. We have a very exciting program for you tonight, and to introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to introduce Joe DiGiorgio from the Canal Town Museum.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like David Letterman, you know, you don't need this kind of stuff, but come on, let's do it again. At any rate, thank you very much. We're very fortunate here. This is a freebie from the Council on the Humanities that they have, and this is our second speaker from the Council of Humanities for this year. And you know we do 4 a year, January, February, March, and April. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Sernett being with us because he is a great history buff, and we like people who love history, as you well know that. Okay, so, and he's an author of at least 8 books, right? A number of essays and articles, and I was very fortunate to call him up one time, and you know, usually people don't want to talk to me very long. And before I go, I had like a decent conversation, and I said, "Hey, this guy's okay." And I really enjoyed it. So I'm not going to say any more about it. He's an award-winning author and speaker, and I think you're really going to get something out of this tonight. Dr. Sernett.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, let's have the house lights down. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, every good talk should start with a testimonial. Just as years ago, if you bought a tractor, you'd get a testimonial from someone who had purchased the same tractor. So here's a testimonial about this talk that comes to you from some students in the FFA down at Scenic Valley. I guess about 2-3 years ago, one winter afternoon, my wife and I, Jan is here. Where's Jan? She's over there with her hand raised. We went down to their high school, and I gave a talk. They came in, starting to snow, blizzard outdoors, you know. I'm thinking, how am I going, you know, 70 or more in the auditorium there. So we give this talk, and then they write me a letter afterwards thanking me, and they all sign the letter, and this is their testimonial. I won't read all of it, but you know so much about these tractors. We didn't realize they were so dangerous back then, and how many problems the tractors had. It was cool. See, these are high school kids. It was cool how you told us they solved the problems on the tractors, especially when you told us about that guy who started a fire under his tractor in cold weather to get it started. We thought farming was hard work now, but it was really hard back then. And this is a paragraph that I like. Your speech was like learning social studies, only interesting. They don't talk about tractors in social studies. Well, I think they should, because what we're going to be talking about this evening isn't the topic merely of the transition from horse farming to tractor farming about 1910 to 1940, but about a tremendous cultural shift that took place in our country from a time when we were predominantly an agricultural country to one where farmers today are less than 1% of the population. Feed not only America, but a good share of the world. So to set that theme, I want to start with this plaque that I have. It was made by Peter Brevard, who contracted polio back in the 1950s. He lives in southern Minnesota, and so to earn his livelihood, he does this artwork. It's called The Transition. And there you see a tractor, probably a Farmall regular, hooked up to an old horse implement with the sun setting behind the head of the farmer. And so it symbolizes for us that transition from muscles to motors, which is the theme of the talk this evening. And the book that is going around is the book that I wrote that's the companion piece to it. Well, at one time, horses ruled. In 1910, there were 23 million horses in this country. And this scene probably comes to us from about the period of what agricultural historians like to call the golden age of farming. About 1905 until the eve of World War I, some say 1900 to about 1920, and then the agricultural depression sets in after the war. Ironically, wars are generally good times for farmers. But this was a time when you could build a fancy new barn and put a cupola on it. It's the period 1904 to 1910 that later on, those of you who are farmers, how many farmers in here grew up on a farm or know a bit about farming? Okay, this is going to be a great time. Well, you've heard the term parity. Parity prices. Well, this was the period that the economists used to set parity prices on. Horses were used for many different tasks on the farm. Here's a power sweep. In fact, there's one at the Franklin County Fair back in Iowa, my home county. They bring out every fair season. Out in the Red River Valley in the Great Plains, they had these multi-horse hitches on these great bonanza farms. You know, there were factory farms back in the late 19th century. These were the great wheat farms. The age of steam, though, began to threaten horses as the only source of power on the farm. In the 1870s and 1880s, steam engines began to appear, but these were giants, as you can see. You ought to go down to Canandaigua sometime for the old-time steam threshers reunion down there and see some of these things fired up. They are massive pieces of iron. And look how many people can crowd around them. Some of them, I can still remember a bit about the age of steam because there was one steam engine that my Uncle Charlie and the threshers ring that they used was still brought around in the early 1940s. And those things were hard to start and hard to keep going. Sometimes they keep them fired up all night long. But now they're almost pieces of art. This is a case, and it's in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. You know, Henry Ford was a great collector of agricultural history. And much of that, I would say almost 90% of it, isn't on display there. They're gradually expanding this, but I love the colors, just the massive symmetry of it. There's an oil pole, a rumbling oil pole. You'll still see some of those around. Out in Iowa, in the smaller farms, horses carried on. You couldn't use these big steam engines on your smaller fields. 240 acres was a decent-sized farm, particularly here in the east. You didn't see many of these big machines because of the hilly farms and so on. But here's a binder reaper at work out in Iowa. Another one that has been fixed up and painted. Now, when the steam engine came in, there was some concern as to, well, what actually could it do? And James Watt, who is credited with the invention of the steam engine, came up with the notion of the definition of horsepower. And 1 horsepower equals 33,000 pounds-feet per minute. Now, a human, can anybody guess how many horsepower a human, let's say, when you were 30 years old and you were in your prime? I mean, not today anymore. 0.1 horsepower. That's what you're good at. Horses weren't just on the farms in the era when horses reigned or ruled. This is downtown Chicago. Dearborn and Michigan Street. think it is, Dearborn and Randolph Streets. And look at the congestion. Streetcars, of course, because you've got electricity, but horses, they say that the problem of manure and horse dung in the cities was so great that you had to shovel little paths sometimes to get across the street. Well, what glorious day it was when these beautiful three, I guess, Percherons, hauling the fire engines. Fire companies kept fire horses, not just fire dogs, but fire horses for many, many years, prided themselves on those. The Horse and Mule Association of America was then founded, particularly now as tractors begin to become a threat to horses, to promote the continued use of horses and mules on American farms. The headquarters were in Chicago, right outside the stockyards. And the man who was the executive secretary for that for many, many years was this man. And in the book that's going around that I wrote, his name is Wayne Dimsmore, by the way. He grew up in Iowa. He taught at Iowa State for a while. And then he became associated with the Percheron Association, then the Horse and Mule Association. And he fought way into the 1940s to try to make a case for the usefulness of the horse, the draft horse or heavy horse, on the farm. And in the book that I wrote, I imagine the story of Wayne Dimsmore now as an elderly gentleman in an Iowa nursing home writing his younger grandson, who's gone off to Iowa State University, like I did in 1960, who is being taught then in his agricultural engineering courses that it was inevitable that the tractor would replace the horse, and it was inevitable that power would replace muscle on the farm. And so he tries to make a case to his grandson of the importance of learning about the horses. Well, here are some of the different breeds of heavy horses or draft horses that were in use on the farms. As of 1930, a horse census. I guess they went from horse to horse. Asked them. Clydesdales, Shires, Belgians, and Percherons. The Percherons, by far, are the most popular breed of workhorse. Belgians second, Shires and Clydesdales. Shires and Clydesdales were your show horses, right? Think of the brewery horses. They weren't as popular amongst farmers because, anybody tell me?
Long days.
Yeah.
They ate too much.
Well, it could well be. It has something to do with their feet. What do they have? Yeah, the feathers on their feet, which got full of mud, and they had all kinds of foot problems and so on. Anybody in here have any experience with Belgians? Work Belgians? Percherons? Yeah.
Belgians and Percherons both.
Okay. So maybe you're the authority, because I've always wanted to ask somebody who knows, which is easier to work with? Which is the
Percherons.
best?
In my opinion, the Belgians that I ever worked for were
ornery.
dunderheads.
Yeah. That's what I've been told.
When you see a pulling horse, you only see Belgians, you never see the other one.
That's right. Well, Belgians are stockier. Some of them thought of them as,
Bigger.
Dutch.
They're bigger.
Yeah. The better puller, but the Percherons were more even-tempered and probably better just for all-around.
Smarter.
Smarter, were they?
Depends who you talk to. I don't think most Belgian breeders would agree with
I
that
just
statement.
saw a report, I just saw more Percherons pulling, an Amish guy was doing the fields out here.
Really?
This afternoon, yeah.
Wonderful.
When I talked with him, all he had to do was just say, whoa, and they all four of them stopped, and then he called them by name.
Was this an Amish farmer or
Molly
not?
and April and somebody else.
Yeah.
And off they started conquering.
Yeah.
And when I worked with them, they're very intelligent.
Well, that settles it, I guess. Percherons, or at least Percheron owners, are more intelligent than Well, those big, huge, massive steam engines were not very practical, particularly on the smaller farms. So the golden fleece that everyone was looking for was a smaller, lightweight tractor, internal combustion tractor. And this is the very first one. This is the tractor that the German inventor John P. Froelich invented. There's a little town in northeast Iowa called Froelich that my wife and I have visited, and this is the tractor. He set an engine on a frame. It could go forwards and backwards. He took it out, I think it was to South Dakota, and did some thrashing of wheat out there. So we credit Froelich in 1892 with inventing the first tractor such as we might know it today. There's one that's been all gussied up. But it wasn't necessarily the tractor itself that was the first experience that many farmers had with the internal combustion engine on their farms. Many of them had their first experience with these smaller gasoline engines like the Sandow. Perhaps you've gone to some of these agricultural shows where they display these. They use them for many different tasks. Here's a lady, she's got her engine attached to her washing machine, and she's reading her Oprah magazine or Gold or something like that. Actually, it's the Breeders' Gazette. The Breeders' Gazette came out of Chicago, one of the great agricultural newspapers of the day. So now our war is joined, the horses versus tractors, muscles versus the machine. There's a tractor and a John Deere tractor and a horse, and I take it that's probably a barrel of gasoline or kerosene that is ready to roll. This is a cartoon done by Bob Artley. Bob Artley grew up in my hometown of Hampton, Iowa, became a very famous cartoonist for the Des Moines paper. And this is saying goodbye to the horse. Now, don't you drive too fast for him. Bye, old Turvey, sniff, sniff. How can we pet a tractor? It was a sad day when we traded one of our draft horses in on our first tractor. We gained some power, but we lost a friend. Well, that was often the debate between the horse crowd and the tractor crowd. The horse crowd would say, you can't pet a tractor. You put one horse together with another horse, you get a baby horse. Put one tractor next to another tractor, what do you get? You don't get a baby tractor, I'll tell you that much. Some people said, well, a horse produces its own manure. And put that back in the fields. The tractor crowd said, you can't work a horse all day long. They got to get some rest. In the heat, you can't work them. You can work a tractor 24 hours a day. So that debate went on and on. There were many power deficiency studies done by the government. And I've always been curious, though, about what was the factor that tipped the scales when an individual farmer said, well, I'm going to go trade in the horses. And sometimes, literally, I'm going to... there you go, Paul. If I stand here, I come back to some. Paul Maybe is back here, Maybe Brothers, Massey Ferguson. Well, years ago, tractor dealers such as the Maybe Brothers would have had perhaps the pen right next to the dealership. And when you traded your horse in, you brought the horses there, and then you got your tractor. That's not done anymore. I don't know where old horses go these days. I don't think there are any places in this country where you can slaughter a horse anymore. I think that's right. I think they
do it now in Missouri.
I was told that they all go up to Canada.
They did.
Yeah. Which always made me wonder, why don't we eat horse meat?
Probably do.
All you pink slime. Well, but I've always been curious. What happened? Did your neighbor get a tractor, and then you wanted to feel up to date with your neighbor, and so then you went and got a tractor? Or what tipped the scales? Well, there was a time when the car was a novelty, and so you get your car stuck in the early 1900s, and somebody with a horse would say, "Get a horse," right? And then you see, a horse come along, chance for a ride, buddy. But you can remember years later, then you drive along in the car, and the kids, "Oh, there's a horse in the pasture. Oh, look, a horse. The horse is a novelty." So that transition took place too. Well, there were many different manufacturers of tractors in those early days. When Henry Ford introduced the Fordson in 1917, 1918, there were over 125 manufacturers of these internal combustion, smaller gasoline tractors. Many times they were just making 2 or 3 of them. It was some blacksmith who decided to cobble together a tractor. You could make your own tractor. You could order the parts from Sears. They called them doodle-bugs. This is one called the Samson. Eventually the Samson was bought out, the California company, as I recall, bought out by Durant, and then Durant and became the General Motors tractor. But in order to introduce this tractor, he thought, well, farmers are kind of traditionalists, So here he is. You control this tractor with reins, as if you were controlling a horse. That was the novelty of it. Here's a Pioneer. It came out of Winona, Minnesota. It weighed, I think, over 10 tons. Look at how big the scale is compared to that gentleman there. You can imagine how that would compact the soil. Well, Henry Ford then comes to the rescue. He had already made a fortune with the Model T. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world, and he hated the drudgery of farming as a young boy growing up in Michigan. And he decided that he would work on the car first, and then he would work on this tractor. And this is one of his papers. But there's Model T. And some of these were converted, the rear end, so you could put a plow on it. And if your soil was very light and sandy, it might work. I don't think it worked too well with some of the clay soil around here. And this is his first tractor. He had Joseph Galumb, I don't know how it's pronounced, but a Hungarian machinist, designer who worked for him, come up with this concept. He used some parts from the Model T, and this is his very first tractor. And here he is testing it out at this track there. Now he's moved, eventually he'll move out to Dearborn. Testing it again. Now, when people heard that Uncle Henry, and farmers loved Henry Ford, he was a kind of down-to-the-earth type, even though he was a mega millionaire, kind of a folksy guy. When they heard that Uncle Henry was going to make a tractor, in fact, Uncle Henry said he was going to make a tractor, a truck, and a car, and sell all 3 for under $600. People got the notion, well, that Ford name, that's quite something. So a couple scoundrels up in Minnesota took the Ford name, put it on well, I guess you could call this a tractor, and tried to sell this with the Ford name. Now, a senator, a congressman out in Nebraska bought one of these things, and it was a total failure. And so that's where they introduced then the legislation that every tractor sold in Nebraska had to be tested, so that it met its specifications of power and so on. So the Nebraska tests are still around today. Ford, therefore, could not put his name on his tractor, so he has to use the name of his son. His son is Edsel, but it becomes the Ford Son tractor. Now, about this time, another dramatic revolution is taking place on American farms. I gave this talk up at Watertown once, and it was audience composed mostly of senior citizens. And afterwards, I said, how many are farmers? Quite a few hands went up, and I said, well, what is the most significant change that took place in your lifetime when you were living on the farm? And I thought for sure they'd all say the coming of the tractor, because I just given them a 45-minute lecture on it. No. One gentleman, electricity. Electricity is the most significant change, and he could remember the day, the month, and the year the electricity came to the farm. It was 1938, April 13th, shall we say. That revolutionized not only what went on in the barn, but what went on in the house, and we'll come back to that here in a bit later on. Well, the first tractors that Henry Ford made then were called MOMS, Ministry of Munitions tractors. They weren't sold here in the United States. World War I is going on. There's a great demand for tractors in Great Britain. Perhaps you know that story that there was almost a threat of hunger in Great Britain as men went off to fight in France. And so this is a tractor being shipped over to Great Britain. About 5,000 of them did. Henry Ford had a long list of American farmers who wanted this tractor, but the first ones went to Great Britain. Then he built this huge facility called the Rouge outside of Detroit at Dearborn. This is where you go today, to the Henry Ford, to the Ford plant. And he was able to do what we call vertical integration. He owned timber lands and mines way up in Michigan. And so he had all the raw materials, and he could bring these raw materials in one end of his huge facility, and at the other end turn out 300 Model Ts a day. It was a marvelous place. He employed thousands and thousands of people, built them homes. He paid them a good wage for the time, $5 a day. He hired blacks. He hired people with handicaps. He did not allow unions, so that was one of his negatives, shall we say. But this is the Rouge. And this is Building B, where the Fords and tractors were made. You see them all lined up there. Building B is gone now. When you go to take the tours, my wife and I did some years ago, you can see where it was, but they make the F-150 Ford pickup there. Now, the new concept now is the assembly line. This happens to be John Deere, but it's the concept that Henry Ford pioneered or introduced on a massive scale. You bring the work to the worker. It's not the old craftsman style where the entire vehicle is assembled by a group of workers, a team. Now it comes just to you, and you might do just one small task on that. So quickly then, some slides here of the marketing that Ford did for his tractor. It was called the Universal Tractor. It was said to be able to do everything on the farm. Well, we'll see that isn't quite true, but everything on the farm. I thought this is interesting. Here's a Fordson hauling a hearse with a horse in it. I don't know quite the symbolism of that, but
He's a tractor boat.
yeah. Here's one where you can see the spokes. The early ones had 6 spokes. The later ones had 7 spokes. The early ones, the wheels tended to crack. I've got mine right here. And so if you count the spokes, you can usually tell about what year it was made or whether it was an earlier or later one. What was truly unique about the Fordson tractor is that the engine, the transmission, and the rear axle are in 3 separate units. The skin of the tractor, that's not quite the right word, forms the frame rather than setting the engine on the frame. So things are enclosed. And this was a revolutionary design that sold these tractors. Here they are putting up hay. Here's the assembly line. Even hired the blind because they could do one task repetitively. Now he sold his tractors through his car dealerships. he was a short line dealer, meaning he didn't have a whole lot of equipment to go with it. In fact, none at all initially. So you had to buy an Oliver plow, for example, to go with it. But he would go to his dealerships and say, now, if you want to sell my Model T or my Model A, I want you to sell 13 tractors this month. He would set quotas for them, and he had an advantage then on some of his competition. This shows us the fender that was put on to the Fordson tractor. The Fordsons initially had a design flaw in that because they had a screw drive, if you hit a rock or a root with a plow, the front end would come up and turn turtle. And many farmers were injured or killed. In fact, the Eastern Implement Dealer, a magazine that wasn't particularly friendly to Henry Ford, said that Henry Ford should put a sticker on every one of his tractors which says, in effect, buy this tractor, prepare to meet thy God. Because it would flip up and turn turtle. Those fenders were some attempt to solve that problem, so if it tipped up, hit the back of the fender. As we'll see, that's not the real solution. There's one being shipped away. And during World War I, then, you were to buy a tractor as a matter of national pride. You supported the war effort, filled the broken ranks of farm labor with tractors. So during World War I, many farmers had to switch over to tractors because you simply couldn't get farm labor. Though there were land girls, like there was in Great Britain, we had our own version of that, city girls who went out to the farms. I must say that the evidence shows that not all farmers were in favor of that, but it was a necessity of the times. Here you can see one of these tractors. One, how many spokes are there? I guess that's a 7-spoker with the fenders. And this particular tractor has run 24 days and 19 hours without an adjustment, smashing the world's record by 500 something. And doing heavy work night and day. All right. This shows Henry Ford's notion that the Fordson tractor was the universal tractor. It could do everything on the farm. Not quite true. There's something missing here. You see it hauling hay, plowing, cultivating, belt work. But there's one task it can't do. Well, you can put lights on it. It could work at night. Yeah.
You can't fertilize the field.
Well, it can pull fertilizer, I suppose.
It doesn't milk the cows.
It can't milk the cows. Now, what does the farmer plants his corn, and the little weeds come up, then he has to do what? Cultivate, right. And some of you remember check row planting of corn, where you planted it almost in checkerboard fashion, where you could look this way in the rows and that way in the rows. Well, the wheel spacing of the Fordson tractors was such that you couldn't, because the width of a corn row was the width of a horse's rump. That was supposedly the old axiom. And you couldn't do that with the Fordson tractor. By 1923, though, over 75% of all tractors on American farms are Fordsons. Ford was able to do that because he subsidized the cost of making a tractor with its profits from the Model A and the Model T. He was selling them initially for $7.95. He kept dropping that and dropping that in order to cut out the competition. He gradually winnowed the field down to about 30 competitors, and then after that, he dropped more and more. But he did so because he was, in essence, subsidizing the cost. Here's some belt work at a fair. And you would have these demonstrations in which tractors from different manufacturers would come together, and the people that are plowing and harrowing, disking, pulverizing. Look at the cars, all gathered together there. Usually they put on a feed, you would have some to eat. Here's the food stand. So it was a social gathering as much as anything else. Now, meanwhile, as Henry Ford is making all of this progress toward dominating the tractor field, there's a giant just beginning to stir, and is represented by Alexander Legge here, who was the CEO, I guess you'd say, of what will become International Harvester. International Harvester is a great, massive conglomeration of other companies that comes together in the early 1900s. Now, they had a long history and a long list of things that they made, going all the way back to Cyrus McCormick and his reaper. But they had no tractor. And eventually, Legge is convinced that they ought to make a tractor. They had the Mogul from, I think the Mogul was from Deering. McCormick and Deering merged together, then they bring in some others, and then they form International Harvester. And then President Theodore Roosevelt tries to bust them up because they're too big. And they had the Titan. But these were bigger, they're more expensive than what the Fordson was. So they come up with a new tractor, the Farm All, which is a name, by the way, that company has brought back. I'm sorry to keep blocking your view. And here's the Farm All, and what is different about it? Narrow front end, right. Now you can cultivate corn as well as doing everything else. It still has, look at those lug wheels though. The first company to introduce rubber tires on tractors was Alice Chalmers in the 1940s. But here's the 100,000 Farm-All in gold. I don't know where it's at today, but that would be fascinating. See? Farm-All plowing and belt work simply can't be surpassed. International Harvester. So now they're rivaling Henry Ford because they can do something, even though their tractor's more expensive, that his tractor can't. And if you got a new tractor, oh, that was a glorious day, and Ma and Pa went, had their picture taken by it. I suppose hung it in the living room, I'm not sure. And even a kid could drive the Farm-All. Some of you remember your first day's tractor driving where you couldn't even quite reach the pedals? Here's Efforter, Pennsylvania, and their dealership. Now, their advantage is they have all of this equipment that they can put behind their tractors. Here's one from Dyersville, Iowa, from the National Toy Museum. If you ever get out that way, it's a fantastic museum. This is a cultivator attached to that. I can remember on a John Deere trying to take that thing on and off. That is a nightmare to wrestle with. But there are many companies that were making skin-em tractors. They were selling stock to folks to buy into a new tractor, and then they either never made a tractor or made a very shoddy one. So this represents that side of the business. Case made a very good tractor. They had a good reputation. J.I. Case Threshing Machine Company out of Racine, Wisconsin. But our next story is the John Deere story. And this is why I put on my John Deere hat. Because I grew up in John Deere country in northern Iowa. And have been was green for a long, long time. John Deere, hailed from New England, came out to Grand Detour, Illinois. The sod in the prairies was pretty sticky, and you couldn't cut it, turn it over with the cast iron plows of the day. And so, you know the story. He comes up with the notion of a steel shank and a plow face, and that slices through the prairie. And eventually he takes his whole business, goes to Moline, and from there John Deere grows. But they don't have a tractor initially. 1847, well into the later 19th century, still no tractor. Until they buy out the Waterloo Boy. The Waterloo Boy is the tractor that is the successor of the Frolic tractor. Waterloo, Iowa, is where it was made. And it was a good tractor. You still see some of them around. They're beautiful machines to see. And they sold for $750. And here's the plant in Waterloo. You'll see the river in the background where those tractors were made. This was for a long, long time the headquarters of tractor making for the John Deere company. And here's the engineering room, the draftsman at the John Deere facility. The John Deere D came out in 1923. The original D, I think the first one is down in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And this was a tractor that was in production for 50 years, and farmers swore by it. Some swore at it because it started with this big wheel. I can remember that. You had to turn, yeah, and it was stiff sometimes on those cold mornings, and whoever designed it put 2 bolts. So if you didn't release your grip immediately, the knuckles caught on these bolts and so on. Here's a John Deere at the Toy Museum. This is not a D, it's probably a C, a smaller version of that. But the John Deere D was a great plowing tractor. Here they're being manufactured. And if I could do my life over, this would be me. I'd be about, what is that young lad, 12, 13, be a beautiful fall day. I'd have my John Deere D, my trusty collie dog there. His name would be Shep. And I'd see my first airplane fly over. That's glory. That's the closest I'll probably get to heaven. I want to re-emphasize the importance of electricity. South of my hometown in Hampton, Iowa, there is the first REA plant. It's now a museum. Rural Electrification Act came in the 1930s. The Grange, was the Grange active around here? The Grange? The Grange fought hard for that because folks in the city had electricity, like power vacuums, power this, power that. But farm wives had nothing. Without electricity, you know, there was so much that made the distance between the farm life and the city life transparent. The first form of electricity was Thomas Edison's. That was a direct current. Well, direct current, as perhaps some of you are more knowledgeable than I am on this matter, you can only send at high voltages a mile or two. So if you weren't close enough to the plant that generated it, you're out of luck. Then Tesla, thank you, Tesla, came up with the notion of alternating current. And in fact, the hydroelectric power that comes from Niagara Falls, that was Tesla's and Westinghouse's installation. There was a battle called the War of the Currents between the Edison system and the Tesla Westinghouse system. And Edison, the reason I tell this story is Edison hired a guy to go around. The guy is, this fellow's Professor so-and-so. You can't trust these professor types. Went around putting on stage shows to demonstrate the evils and dangers of alternating current. And as part of his show, he would electrocute dogs and horses. And that was quite a fight that they had. But eventually, alternating current wins out, and that is what the REA introduced, and farmers eventually got. But in terms of changes that come now with this social revolution that's taking place, it wasn't just electricity. In fact, predating electricity was the phone. How many of you can remember being on a party line? Party line? Who can remember your ring? Too short. Too shorts? Too long, too short. Too longs, too shorts, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. And there was a general switchboard, right? Did you have something like this that you cranked? Yeah. Well, some of you may have indulged in what is known as rubbery. Huh? No? Yeah, without television, this is where the phone rings, but it's not your ring, but you pick it up and you do a little eavesdropping. But you daren't get carried away. You know, you can't say, well, Maude, I don't think that's right. You got to be careful. But they would also have a general ring in case there was an emergency and so on. One time I gave a talk, and a gentleman told me that there's a way you can do this. There's something you can take out of the mouthpiece, some little part of it, so that they don't know that you're rubbering. I don't know if that's true or not. I wouldn't recommend it. The telephone came in already in the late 19th century, and so many farmers had telephones before they had electricity, and some of them even had radios because you could have a battery-powered radio. By the way, I should have said you could have electricity before the REA put the lines down your road, because you could get a Delco system. I think these were big storage batteries you could put down in the basement, and they might power 40 watts for a while. But radio was quite the novelty, and all these things began to break down the social isolation of the farms. I can remember my Uncle Charlie, every noon hour after lunch, he would come in, or he would listen to the radio to get the hog reports, decide if he should ship hogs to Waterloo or Chicago or wherever. But this is from a mechanics magazine back in the early part of the last century, imagining the day would come when the farmer could sit in his house and control his tractor by radio. Well, we're not far from that, are we? With the GPS system that they have today. Rural free delivery. Again, farmers fought for rural free delivery. The first trial of that was in 3 routes in West Virginia back in 1886, I believe. There is a U.S. Postal Museum in Washington, D.C., not far from the historic train station there, that is really worth a visit. And it shows how important mail delivery was, not just to the nation as a whole, but farmers in particular. This was, again, their contact with the outside world. Even now, for me, a high moment of the day is when I hear the rumble of the UPS truck come up the driveway. Road building. In the early 1900s, roads were a terrible mess, particularly in the spring, about this time of year when the thaw, went out, and those Model Ts, the reason that they were high clearance and so on were okay, but road building, there were national and statewide and local road building societies, and I don't know, you can almost imagine, right, a Watson wagon. Where's Joe at? There's Joe. Yeah, a Watson wagon come. Well, this is after the Watson wagon, because now we got a truck and so on. But the Watson wagon came in. You'll hear Joe say a bit about them, because they were such a new concept about speeding up the work of bringing your fill and so on for making your roads. And that all comes right out of Chittenden. Well, by this time, particularly Cornell and other schools like that are introducing extension services, beginning to try to teach farmers about power and efficiency on the farm. And so here's a little bit of propaganda, shall we say, for that. A workman is known by his tools, and here's a farmer who's got shoddy tools, and so his whole farm looks kind of sad. Here's somebody a little more progressive. A workman is known by his tools, and he's got some more update equipment. But this is the message they wanted to preach in this rural gospel of efficiency. Soil fertility, modern equipment, modern methods, and good machinery, get you over to profits, profits, profits. There were even magazines dedicated to tractor farming now. And then along comes Harry Ferguson. Like Henry Ford, a tough Irishman. Ferguson was a genius, and he comes up with the concept of, to solve this problem of the tractor bucking up in the front and turning over. You might know it as the three-point hitch system, draft control. And so this is Henry Ford and Ferguson meeting at Henry Ford's estate, Fairlane Estate there outside Dearborn. And they're demonstrating this method on one of the tractors that Ferguson brought over. And they have this famous handshake deal, I think the year is 1938, in which Ford will make the tractors and Ferguson will make the implements. Well, that goes on for a while, using now the Ferguson system. And the Ferguson system shows the safer way versus the older way. Then World War II comes, and there's a great hue and cry here for making things here in America and so on. And so Henry Ford II, the grandson of Henry Ford, breaks this handshake deal, begins to put the Ferguson system on Ford's tractors, and before long, there's a huge lawsuit that goes on for years and years and years. Now every tractor today has some version of that system. There's Henry Ford tipping his hat to a young lad. I'm not sure what this is. Is that a Fergie? Could well be. A Ferguson tractor. Henry Ford made the 9N, the 2N, and the 8N. By the time he got to the 8N, he had totally taken over Ferguson's system, illegally, you might say, and so it went on a long court suit. John Deere has its own magazine, John Deere Tradition. And here's an unstyled John Deere A, I think it is. Yellow and green has been their color all these many years. And of all the companies that make tractors, the only one that has never been bought out or merged or somehow changed its corporate identity today is John Deere, right? And if you are a John Deere fan, as I was until Paul maybe convinced me to buy a Massey Ferguson, you would want to go to the Vatican of John Deere. This is as close as you'll get if you're a John Deere fancier to heaven. Go to Moline, Illinois, and see the John Deere museum display there. You can buy everything. Buy John Deere socks, John Deere underwear. You can go the whole thing there. And here I am with my son Matt on my brother-in-law's John Deere D many years ago. I thought if by osmosis, if nothing else, I could turn him into a tractor fancier. It didn't work. Although our granddaughter does play some with the tractors I have. Here's my cousin's John Deere out on the Iowa farm. They just recently stopped the beef production there. But look at how big that thing is. Something about it, I never, I guess, appreciated them too much because the scale is so out of proportion to the human scale anymore. I grew up with the smaller ones.
Are they still making John Deeres in this country?
That's it. Yes. They are still making some John Deeres in this country.
Yeah.
If you're interested in the story of farm antiques, I can recommend this magazine, The Farm Collector. And one issue was devoted entirely to the Ford tractor, how Ford transformed the farm, Ford turns 100. So finally, if you happen to see a piece of rusty iron like this in somebody's field, tip your hat to it. It's got a story to tell. So, thank you.
Just tell you something about Rossi Wagon. Dr. Sernett said, hey, listen, you have to talk about the wagon just for a couple of minutes anyway. And I didn't twist your arm on that one, did I?
No.
I didn't want to, but he gave us a little gift here today, something, Good Roads magazine. This is from 1905. It's something Watson invented for a wagon, and that was, sometimes we call them a belly wagon. Right? Belly wagon, why? Because it drops from the bottom. Okay, and that's what this wagon does. It drops from the bottom. And so he gives me a nice cartoon. He says, the Watson dump wagon has a chain outside the body. And here's the guy under his belly. He's got the chain under the belly. And I think that's a great advertisement, and we're going to be using it for our demonstration. But real fast, I want to tell you something about how farmers got the Watson wagon. Now, they couldn't afford it, for the most part. Okay? For the most part, a farmer didn't go and get Watson and buy a Watson wagon. Because Watson wagons, they cost some money. They were the most expensive dump wagon on the market. And they made them expensive because they were built very well. Better than any other wagon. Even better than the wannabe wagon that we have. Okay. And some of you know about my wannabe wagons that Canastota now has. We're going to have two wagons, by the way, and they're going to both be on the same site. One's going to be in the garage, and one's going to be out there so you can see it. Well, at any rate, how do farmers get it? Well, a construction company would buy several of them. And when they finished the road building, if they were doing that, instead of transporting them to their next job, it was cheaper for the construction company to sell them to the farmer. And that's how the farmers ended up with the bottom dump wagons, for the most part. Okay, yeah, give me $15, it's yours. Give me $20, it's yours. The farmers jumped right out. And some of them are still being used today. And so that's the story about how farmers received the Watson wagon. Most farmers couldn't afford it unless they were subsidized by the government. But that didn't happen until 1930s or so. Okay? So, at any rate, I want you all to come on May 5th to our dedication and celebration for our building, and there'll be a legitimate Watson wagon. And in the meantime, just before that, maybe in a couple of weeks, come and see our 4-paneled kiosk. It will explain the whole history of Watson wagon, and even a little bit of history of a tractor truck that Watson Wagon Company had made. Okay, so thank you very much for giving me the 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, that fit in very well with the story we're telling.
Right now, so I would like to give another round of applause to this gentleman who's done a great job.
Very quickly, we have some of the Horse and Tractor Wars books. Some of the images you've seen, there are many more in here. And I also have copies of my Say Cheese book, which is a story of the era when New York State cheese was king. Perhaps you know that at one time, until 1909, we were the leading cheese-making state in the nation, cheddar cheese in particular. And if you go up just north of Rome, you will find a monument where, up by the Rome Fish Hatchery, out across the road there where Jesse Williams' farm was. It was Jesse Williams who in 1851 pioneered the cheese factory concept. And at the end of the 19th century, there were over 1,000 cheese factories here in upstate, or here in New York State. The famous cheese crescent came right through here. So there's that book. And there's also the book I wrote, Cradle of the Breed, which is a story of Gareth Miller and the importation of the first 4 Holstein cattle, they were called Dutch cattle, in 1869 to Peterborough. And from them, many great Holstein families came from. So if you're interested, we have signed copies. They're $20 each, or a mix of any 2 at $15 each. So you have to do that. Any questions or comments before we... I don't know, what time do they roll up the streets and turn off the lights? Long day.
You mentioned International Harvester. I remember growing up in Vermont that once a year the International Harvesting Company would come through town and they'd have a show.
Oh.
And it was the only live show you ever got to see. And they came once a year. And
were there dancers, Tom?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think I'd remember those. But there was a stand-up comic.
No kidding.
Yeah. And he would always start with International Harvester, I-H,
yeah.
And then he'd flip it up and it'd say,
Hi. That's the way you know it's right.
Yeah, in Vermont, they'd laugh at that. Well, I can remember when John Deere introduced their so-called new generation of tractors in 1960. When they went away, the John Deere tractor were called Johnny Poppers, right? Papa Johnnies, because they were 2 cylinders, yeah. And then they introduced the new generation of tractors. Well, there was a big event at the dealership there in northern Illinois. I went with my brother-in-law. We saw movies, some like old-time westerns, and they had beans and chips and soda pop, and so I don't know what did the Maybe brothers do, Paul. Can you count that?
Oh, well, occasionally have hot dogs.
Hot dogs. Well, that's what it was. Yes, back there.
The first tractors I ever operated were Al Chalmers on Muckley, and if I'm not mistaken, there's a connection between Central New York and Al Chalmers, right? I believe one of those names
Came out of Casanova.
Right.
Yeah. Matthew Ertz, U-R-T-Z, who is the Madison County historian, had written about that link between, and I forget which side of it was, but he came out of Casanova.
Was the WC the first Dallas Chalmers on route or not? It was pretty close to it.
I think so, yeah.
My grandfather had it. That was his first tractor, was a WC. We didn't have hands enough to drive it. So we had
A lot of
to
suckers.
hold the brake levels.
Those are collector's items, those WC.
This is at the dump a long time now.
Well, this phenomenon where usually gentlemen, but not always the case, men who've been farmers and retired, and then suddenly they get the notion that they should find a tractor like the first one that their dad owned or something like that. So they'll scour the nation, and finally they'll find one. And then they'll spend like 12 years restoring it. They'll get parts, they'll go, and so on. And then I was like, well, what's the payoff? The payoff is that once every year, they get to ride it in a parade. But, if you're retired, it doesn't take much. Yes?
See, what was the name of Woods Tabor over here in Eaton that made these steam traction?
Yes. In Eaton, they made Woods Tabor
and Morse.
Morse.
Right.
Yeah.
They got
They had a 4x4 engine, 4-wheel drive.
Oh, really?
And it's steered four-wheel. And there's a fellow over here in Pompey Road that's got a case traction engine, all nicely colored, painted,
Really?
like you're showing here. And he told me that it takes him 2 hours from a cold firebox to get a full set of steam. Throwing the cordwood in there.
Yeah, they required a lot of, they were high maintenance, put it that way.
Did your studies show that farms got consolidated and bigger after the tractor?
Yes, that was one of the secondary benefits, shall we say, or I don't call it a benefit or not, but as tractors got bigger, the fences went down. I noticed this going back to Iowa over the years, the fences are gone. And even in some cases, the farmsteads are gone. The whole rural landscape has changed.
Well, I mean, you go back to the Dust Bowl, not only, I mean, the part was the Dust Bowl, but the hideous picture of the tractor bulldozing the houses, but that was
That's right.
It was a different situation, too.
Yeah, I don't know whether we've reached our limit because the roads are just so wide you can only get a big tractor down the road with your equipment. Well, thank you very much for coming this evening. Those of you who are basketball fans,